If you're using stories to learn a new language, then you have accidentally stumbled upon the best way to expand your vocabulary into the stratosphere. But you probably still have questions like, how often should I look up words? What should I focus on? Should I actually try to memorize words? Look, if you care at all about growing your vocabulary in the language that you're learning, this is a video you need to pay close attention to. Now look, a word of warning to you if you are new to learning languages with stories. This is going to be very different from what you're used to. So make sure you stay till the end to get a full picture of how this works. Memorizing? No. Translation? No. Vocab tests? Definitely not. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Ollie Richards, and as the creator of the story learning method, I'm going to begin by giving you a very specific process for learning new words with story learning, and we'll use that as the starting point for us answering the questions that I know you're going to have. So what should you focus on when you are reading? New vocabulary or something else? The basic answer is no, you're not going to focus on learning vocabulary. When you're reading, you're going to focus on the plot. See, the ultimate goal with reading anything is to read for enjoyment. So focusing on anything else when you're reading is missing the point. Because to understand the plot, you have to get through the words first, and understanding the words is a vehicle to understanding the plot. Now, obviously, to learn the language, if you're new to it, you need to learn the words, right? So you might see no difference between this. Like, is it the plot or is it the vocabulary? Surely I need to do both. But here's the crucial difference. If you focus on the plot of the story you're reading, then you develop the ability to learn to read independently. But if you focus on the vocabulary always, then every word you don't know becomes like an objective for you. Every time you see a new word, I have to learn it. And this can lead you to derailment because you just end up obsessing over every new word, which means you don't get on with the story. And remember, you don't need to understand every word in order to follow the plot. So the high level concept here is to focus always on reading for enjoyment, and then eventually you'll be able to read naturally without any limits, and the vocabulary will just follow as a byproduct of that, just like you learnt your first language through reading as well. So at which step do you look up words then? Well, here is the process that I recommend, assuming that you are reading stories that have relatively short chapters. First of all, step one, read through the chapter to the end. This is going to involve probably some struggle on your part, and you're going to be focusing on understanding the story, nothing else. Step two, go back and read that chapter again. Same thing, go back to the beginning, read it again. Step three, if you have, like in my short storybooks, for example, a summary of the chapter, then you can read that as well. Step four then will be to look at some key words, ideally using a word list so you don't have your head in the dictionary. And the point then of looking at some key words is unlock your understanding of the plot in that chapter itself. It's not to memorize words. By looking up some of the key vocabulary, you are just unlocking your comprehension a bit. And then step five is to go back and read it again until the gist of the chapter, the main elements of the plot are clear. That's the 5-step process. Read the chapter through, read it again, look at the chapter summary, look up some keywords to unlock your comprehension a bit, and then keep reading it again until you get to a point of clarity where you can understand the plot. And this is going to creep up. So the first time you read it through, you might only understand 50%. Second time, 55%. Third time, 60%, 65, 70. So you can see how with 4 or 5 times through a chapter of the book, you're getting your comprehension up to the kind of 70, 80% it needs to be in order to understand what's going on. So in this process, you are not looking up words at the start. If you want to look up words, you should do it only once you feel like you've been trying to read it and you just can't squeeze any more juice out of reading alone with no help. And this could be the 3rd or the 4th time through a chapter. Remember, you have to push yourself. This struggle that I'm describing here is the point. It is the learning process. And only when you can't get any further by yourself do you look for help. Well, looking up words is a bit like that, right? You want to look up just enough, pour a little bit of water into the stew just to loosen it up so that you get something that then is edible. The point of looking at words is not to memorize it, it's to help your understanding of the plot. This is also nothing about trying to avoid translation or anything. The point of not looking up words is just to facilitate that understanding of the plot so you can build the ability to read independently. What do you think of that stew analogy? Does that make any sense? If you thought that analogy makes sense, let me know by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting that notification bell too, so I can send you future videos. So what level of comprehension should you be aiming for? When is it enough? When should you be satisfied and move on to the next chapter of the story? Let me make this very simple. Your aim when you're reading a story is to understand just enough of the gist of what's going on and to derive some value from it. As soon as you feel that you can follow what's going on, you're good. You are categorically not aiming for 100% comprehension. And it is perfectly fine if there is a lot that you don't understand. I would say your ballpark is around about 60 to 70% as an absolute minimum, all right? Remember, you can understand a lot without knowing every word. And it's just like when I discovered StoryLearning on top of that mountain in Argentina. I mean, I had no choice but to read that book because I was too scared to go back to sleep. It was difficult, but I struggled and I pushed on. And it was the fact that I struggled and I kept pushing myself that led me to that breakthrough. You've got to strain, you've got to struggle. If you're finding it too easy, then you're reading below your level. So this leads us to the important question of how to use StoryLearning, how to read as a complete beginner when you don't know any words yet. Well, this brings us to one of the central points of learning through stories, which is to read just above your current level, and this is known as comprehensible input. At every stage of your learning, from day one to fluency, the material that you find, the stories themselves that you're reading, needs to be at the right level. And what this means is, you know it's the right level when, with effort, you can understand the gist of what's going on. You've seen material like this before in your beginner textbooks. I'm sure you've used one before where with the very, very simple dialogues. With StoryLearning, it's the same thing, except rather than just generic dialogues, you've got stories that are written for beginners with simple language and lots of repetition. And then the process is exactly the same. So for the first few days of learning a new language, you've got to learn some basic words. Obviously, you've got to learn he, she, go, want, eat, have. But then remember, every language has a core of 1 to 200 words, which account for 50% of everything you ever read. These basic words, they repeat so often that just by the fact of sitting and reading these stories over and over, you learn them automatically. You don't need to memorize them, really. Just through reading, you're going to learn them, again, if you're using material at the right level. And when you get your first 1 to 200 words, that unlocks so much that then you can actually start to read more interesting stuff. So what we're talking about here is a combination of a very simple story and learning a minimum core of words. But there's more here as well, because through this basic reading, you discover other things. So you discover how basic verbs conjugate. You discover cognates, which can unlock tons of vocabulary that you already know in the language. And also at the beginner stage, in order to just get this into your head, you're going to have a lot of repetition, all right? So when you're reading basic stories for beginners, you might be reading these 10, 20, 30, 40 times. That's absolutely fine because you're getting familiar with the language and just acclimatizing to what's going on. But you'll be amazed how very quickly you can start to understand a lot. And you can see this happening in week 1 of my Italian project. Some languages do take longer than others, obviously, but the process doesn't change. The key at every step is to have material at the right level. So how do you balance repetition of those stories versus new input? How do you know how often to kind of keep reading the same thing versus moving on to the next thing? Right. So on the one hand, you've got a complete beginner and then a fluent speaker, a very high level speaker on the other hand. How would your reading change at that stage? Well, as a complete beginner, this is a very unique stage, right? You're not a complete beginner for long, but as a complete beginner, you're reading a small number of things many times over just to get a handhold on the language. So there's lots of repetition. But at a high level, what you're aiming for here is free reading for pleasure, just like you do in your own language. You pick up a novel because you like the sound of it, you read it for pleasure, and then you move on. There's no repetition involved, right? This is the ultimate aim because then you get so much input that you just learn naturally. So we've got two contrasting things here, right? A beginner reads very narrowly with lots of repetition, and then a higher level learner reads freely with no repetition. So the question is, what happens in between? What happens between the complete beginner stage and the expert stage? It's a bridge where you gradually move away from lots of repetition to not much repetition. It's a gradual shift. What we want to do is aim to always be moving towards reading for pleasure. So as soon as you can, pick up a book of stories and just read them for pleasure and nothing else. That's what you should pursue, because that's what makes you read like a native speaker, when you're just reading for pleasure. And remember, in our first language, we grow the vocabulary that we have by reading stuff. That's where we get our vocabulary from. People that don't read have a much smaller vocabulary than people that do. And you can make this shift happen as your comprehension gets better. It's a gradual process. So it's impossible to give exact numbers for how many times you should read or reread a chapter. It depends on your level, it depends on the material. And remember, if the material's not at your level, all of this goes out the window, because if it's far too hard for you, it's not going to work. As a rule of thumb though, and this is what I tend to recommend with my short story books, I say aim for 3 to 5 times per chapter. So the first time you read it, ideally it's a bit of a struggle. Second, third, fourth time, you're just gradually noticing new things, decoding the language, looking up a few new words. And then the 5th time you read through, you're able to follow the plot and actually really understand and enjoy it. Remember, for the story learning method to work long term, you've got to cover a lot of ground. And this is advice that I give in my story learning courses a lot when I'm coaching students through the process. I always say, when you're reading a chapter, have a bias towards moving on before you're ready, before you're comfortable, because so many questions and doubts that you've got right now will solve themselves naturally over time. And so you always want to have a bias towards moving on and covering more ground. As ever, I'm going to keep drilling this in. The key is you've got to be reading stuff at the right level. And this is finding material at the right level is the gap that I'm trying to fill with all of my work, because one of the big challenges here is actually finding material that's always at the right level for you, right? So what about memorization? How do you learn vocabulary and get it to stick in your memory? So far, we've been talking about process, haven't we? But what about actually memorizing and learning? So how often should you review these new words? How do you get them to stick? Well, look, at school, we are used to memorizing lists of words. I remember I used to get sent home from my French classes at school with a list of 20 words to remember by next Thursday. And in this scenario, the point of memorizing lists is just to keep reviewing words, because if you review them lots and lots of times, you'll eventually know them. But the thing about reading is that reading gives you natural review. Well-written material, or material that sticks on the same topic, will inevitably repeat keywords and ideas, even grammar points. They will repeat lots and lots and lots and lots. So the best way to remember new words is to actually keep reading, because the words that matter, you'll see them again and you'll review them naturally. Not only that, you're seeing them in context, which means you get to learn how to use them, which is something that you don't always get from using flashcards or more rote forms of memory. And so on this point of flashcards, should you use flashcards or memory techniques to help you learn vocabulary? Well, I'm a fan of flashcards used right. The trouble is, it's very difficult to use flashcards right. And one of the big problems is that in order to use flashcards the right way, it takes a huge amount of time and management as well, because you have to be always changing and reviewing your flashcard decks. So my first kind of question when it comes to flashcards is, look, what if you just stopped doing that and plowed all of that time into more reading, which is just upping the amount of input that you get. The basic rule here, and you remember this from rule number 1 of story learning, is trust in the process. If you keep reading and trust that you will learn words that you need naturally as part of the process, then you will be okay. But if you're going to use extra devices like mnemonics, for example, or flashcards, and I do use both of these things, the main thing is to be hyper selective. Only focus or only try to learn or memorize vocabulary or phrases that you consider life or death, and then get back to reading. Because a maximum of, I'd say, 5% of your overall time should be spent on things like flashcards. It's a bit like that stew analogy again, the food is there, you just need to add a little bit of water to loosen it up and make it ready to eat. That should be the role of flashcards. Just add a little bit in, just to help to move things along a bit. Now, what about low frequency words, the ones that you don't see all that often? How would you ever memorize those? So for this, low frequency words are things that's a case where things like flashcards or memory techniques can actually come in handy, but it's something you should only do in the higher levels, when you are kind of in the upper intermediate stage, where you can already read quite confidently, but you just need a bit of help with those actually memorizing those words that you don't see that often. But really, the better strategy is to read around your areas of interest. So for example, when I was learning Japanese a while back, I remember spending a lot of time reading about language acquisition because it's something that interests me. And at first, I would come across difficult vocabulary. So words in that topic area was acquisition and acquire, cognition, things like that. And it was really hard for me. But I kept reading on that topic, and again, eventually I learned them naturally by reading paper after paper after paper on that topic. Again, the key is to read at your level. If you are reading at a comfortable level, that is when you can relax enough to actually acquire new words. Lastly, what about the role of listening in all of this? How does listening help you learn vocabulary? Does it have any effect on the vocabulary? Well, look, the main thing here is don't think of listening as a separate activity. Think about adding listening as enhancing your reading. Because when you hear what you read, your brain is getting more engaged. So there's more to kind of hang on to. Now, I told you earlier about how I was reading in Japanese about language acquisition. Well, I was also listening at the same time, always listening and reading together. And that really sped things up because certain words just become a lot more memorable when you can hear them. Like the word acquire, to acquire in Japanese, kakutoku suru, kakutoku, kakutoku. There's a real strong ring about it. It's one of the great things about Japanese. And so by seeing that word and hearing it all the time, it's like crack cocaine for the brain. So just focus on listening while you read and you'll find that you remember far more words. And the best thing is, it doesn't even take you any extra time because you just listen as you read. And you can even take that audio and listen at times when you can't read, like when you're driving or something. So what's not to love about all of this? But remember, in all of this, everything we've talked about here, you've got to keep your eye on the ball because it's so easy to slip back into old habits. So right now, what I want you to do is watch this video where you're going to learn the 3-part story learning method, which includes not just how to learn new vocabulary, but actually activate it so you can learn to speak fluently too. This is a long-ish video, but it's the #1 thing you can do right now to take this story learning idea from strange concept on YouTube to a reality in your life. So click the video over here and watch that right now.